So, a really long time ago, Portugal was hot shit. They were considered a global power and everyone thought they were super cool. One of the primary factors that contributed to their coolness was because they had this thing called Brazil. But then one day the people that lived in Brazil decided they didn't want to be a part of Portugal anymore. Well, Portugal didn't take too kindly to this, so they fought a war for a few months and Portugal kind of maybe didn't win that one. After Brazil was out of the picture, Portugal basically lost its status as a superpower. 1 century of declining regional influence later, and the people in Portugal decide they really don't want to do this whole monarchy thing anymore, and we now have the First Portuguese Republic. The First Republic was pretty weak and didn't do a whole lot. After a military coup in 1926 and a totally free and democratic constitutional referendum, the Estado Novo came to be. The Estado Novo was headed by a guy by the name of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Salazar was kind of fascist. He did have everyone do that whole Roman salute thing, but mostly just authoritarian and Catholic, which is kind of why he supported Franco in the Spanish Civil War. So anyway, World War II ends and the United Nations is not in the mood for any of that colonialism stuff. All the other European powers begrudgingly give up their colonies, but not Portugal. You see, Salazar was a strong believer that Portugal's overseas colonies in Africa and elsewhere were an integral part of Portugal. However, the people in those African colonies weren't too happy with the situation. Despite the fact that the Portuguese government had made the very generous move to stop calling them colonies and instead calling them provinces, most of the people living there weren't even Portuguese citizens. The only people there who did have citizenship were white settlers from the mainland. The massive inequality between the white settlers and indigenous and Africans made the people living there just a little bit upset, and this culminated in a series of revolts caused by poor working conditions on Angolan cotton plantations in 1961. The protesters burned their employee cards and attacked Portuguese traders. The Portuguese Air Force allegedly responded with napalm. The revolt was the beginning of a long and brutal struggle for independence that would go on for over a decade. The war in Angola began in 1961 after the plantation revolts. 2 groups would take up arms, the MPLA and the FNLA. The rebels immediately began calling for local Angolan peasants to join their struggle against the Portuguese. The rebel groups also began attacking Portuguese settlers, killing over 1,000. These attacks resulted in international sympathy for the Portuguese and really hurt the rebels' PR. The Portuguese quickly began a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, quickly overrunning rebel positions, and by the end of 1961, the Portuguese military had essentially pushed the rebels out of Angola and into the jungles of the Congo. The Angolan campaign was probably the most successful of the war for a few reasons. The rebels were essentially fighting their own civil war while fighting the Portuguese because the MPLA was Soviet-backed and the FNLA was American-backed. This made any sort of unified attack basically impossible. The Portuguese were also given help from their buddies in apartheid-era South Africa, who also happened to hate those damn commies who the Portuguese happened to be fighting. Basically, the war in Angola was a sweep for the Portuguese, and while fighting didn't completely stop until the end of the war, the fighting that was going on was just small ambushes that didn't really amount to anything. The fighting in Portuguese Guinea started in 1963, and was probably the most difficult of the entire war. Unlike in other fronts of the war, the main opponent in Guinea, the PAIGC, was well-trained and had considerable support from neighboring nations and was thus able to establish safe havens in countries like Senegal and Guinea, which is different from Portuguese Guinea, by the way, very confusing I know, making it very difficult for the Portuguese to effectively fight them. The Portuguese even tried attempting a coup in neighboring Guinea at one point in an attempt to target PAIGC's safe havens. For most of the war, the Portuguese only controlled a small chunk of land outside the colonial capital of Bissau. In 1968, the Portuguese placed General Antonio de Spinola in charge of the conflict. Spinola tried several new tactics to try to gain the support of the people, like increasing the number of African soldiers in the Portuguese army. Spinola also attempted to employ the use of amphibious weapons on the battlefield in an attempt to navigate the incredibly swampy terrain that soldiers were fighting in. None of this really seemed to help, and the Portuguese had essentially gotten themselves into a military stalemate. Some historians think the Portuguese knew from the very beginning they weren't going to win, and just kept fighting because they thought that if they let the rebels in Portuguese Guinea win, then the rebels in other colonies would think they could win. The Portuguese would devote most attention to this front of the war, and its similarities with the other war against commies in the jungle fought by the Americans had led many to call it Portugal's Vietnam. Fighting in Mozambique would start in 1964, making it the last front in the war to start fighting. The fighting was done by Frelimo, another Soviet-backed group. For the first few years, Frelimo was able to control a considerable amount of territory in the north, aided by safe havens in neighboring Tanzania. However, the Portuguese began stepping up their game in the early 70s and were able to employ logistical and military assistance from Rhodesia, a nation that, much like South Africa and Angola, assisted the Portuguese due to its anti-communist sentiment. However, the Portuguese attempts to gain the hearts and minds of the people fell flat on their face. A Portuguese company of soldiers massacred an entire village, killing around 300 people in 1972. This severely damaged both the local and international reputation of the Portuguese. Another attempted PR boost was the construction of several infrastructure projects. The Portuguese wanted to show both the local population and the world that they really cared about their overseas provinces, which are totally not colonies. The most notable of these projects was the Cahora Dam. At any given time during the war, over half the Portuguese troops stationed in Mozambique were busy building this dam. Frelimo made repeated attempts to sabotage the dam, none of which were effective. In the end, the dam was relatively counterproductive in its efforts to gain the public support for the Portuguese. The construction of the dam displaced thousands of peasants and deprived many local farmers of seasonal floods that helped them grow crops. This in turn resulted in even more hatred for the Portuguese. Despite these setbacks, counterinsurgency efforts by the Portuguese essentially had the territory completely under their control by 1973. In 1968, General Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who had been a central figure in the Estado Novo since its inception almost 40 years earlier, suffered a stroke and became unable to lead the country. His death 2 years later would cause great uncertainty as to who would succeed him. The death of Salazar would contribute to the waning influence of the Estado Novo itself. By the early 70s, while Portugal itself was doing very well economically, the cost of the war was steadily increasing, taking upwards of 40% of Portugal's annual budget. This combined with the growing unpopularity of the war both inside Portugal and internationally. With no clear end in sight after over a decade of fighting, a group of left-wing military officers, known as the MFA, began plotting. Finally, on the 25th of April 1974, the MFA seized several key positions in Portugal, and within hours, the Estado Novo collapsed and its leaders were removed from power. Ceasefire agreements were signed in Africa, and by 1975, Portuguese troops had withdrawn and the African territories had been granted independence. The immediate aftermath of the revolution and subsequent independence movements presented problems for African conscripts employed by the Portuguese. As the war went on, the Portuguese began increasingly relying on African conscripts due to the fact that a large number of Portuguese men were emigrating out of Portugal to avoid the draft. At the war's end, African conscripts, most of whom were without Portuguese citizenship, were now considered traitors in their newly independent countries. Many tried desperately to apply for Portuguese citizenship to avoid being left behind. Those who were left behind faced severe repression. In Portuguese Guinea, over 7,500 African conscripts who had fought for the Portuguese were executed by PAIGC guerrillas. Countless others, in all fronts of the war, were executed and buried in unmarked graves. White settlers were also leaving. Upon the announcement of independence, over 1 million Portuguese would leave the African colonies. Fighting would quickly resume in Angola and Mozambique in civil wars that would kill over 1 million. The former Portuguese territory of Timor-Leste would face an Indonesian invasion and occupation. Portugal would hold on to Macau for another 25 years until it joined China in 1999. Portugal itself, after a few years of instability following the Carnation Revolution, is now a stable multi-party democracy. Now over 40 years later, the war still has an imprint on the national psyche of millions of Portuguese.